right. Well, welcome to today's webinar, Tiny Homes, a small answer to a big problem. My name is Jessica, and I am the trade show and event manager for the Western Retail Lumber Association. And I'm also going to be your host and your facilitator today. Before I get started, I really want to take a moment and thank our sponsor today, which is Axio. Axio is really proud to sponsor today's webinar. They offer software solutions to support building materials centers across Canada and hardware stores in their daily operations. They currently serve more than 1,000 businesses across Canada. And I'm going to do a quick brief video on their OGASys solution that can optimize your business efficiency before we get started. Hopefully I'm doing this correctly. Oops, play. All right, so thank you again to Axio for being our sponsor today. Oops, almost hit play again there. Sorry, guys. So I just want to give you the housekeeping rules on today. So many of you have attended before, but if you need to ask Lee a question, you can post it in the chat below or the Q&A. I'm going to monitor them and facilitate them with Lee at the end of his presentation today. And this session is being recorded, so don't worry, I will send out the recording to everybody afterwards. So I'd like to introduce and welcome Lee. Thank you so much for being here. He is the Executive Director of the Tiny Home Alliance of Canada. He's an international chartered housing professional, ED of the Tiny Home Alliance, writer for Invisible People, and a peer reviewer for the Green Municipal Fund through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. In addition, he is also an international best-selling author, singer-songwriter, recording artist with Project Mantra, community organizer, published poet, children's author, rock music journalist, editorialist, and he also just happens in his spare time to have a cable access talk show and be a mental health advocate. So welcome, Lee. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. That's such a beautiful introduction. I want to throw just briefly that display picture, which is a much more attractive version of me. If you could throw that up again, just one more time. One more time.
One more time. Okay, we'll put up that fabulous picture of you there.
Thank you.
Let's
There's
just
an anecdote to this. There's a purpose to what I'm doing. So please.
There we go.
So that picture was taken by a beautiful, charming, wonderful photographer. Her name is Charlotte Robertson. It was taken outside of her property. And we were, I think, about 20 feet away because it was during wave 1 of COVID-19. And she took this picture. This is the same picture that appears in the book that I contributed to. I should note through this when it says international bestselling author, that's very true. But I should say co-author. There were 12 people who contributed to a book that actually went to #1 in 4 countries on Amazon's bestseller list and made it onto, I think, something like 46 best-selling lists. And I'm very,
congratulations.
very
honored. Oh, wow.
Thank you so much. No one can ever take that from me as long as I live. But I have to admit, at the same time, it was one of those inspirational prose books I generally wouldn't buy or read. But I was asked to participate in this project, and I was grateful to. And she was a love interest of mine at one point and a great person that I'm very proud of, and a former member of our board, Tiny Home Alliance of Canada, back in the day. And we've been able to maintain a tremendous friendship and she took that picture as a favor to me, and I'm really happy that that picture ended
Oh,
up
that's
in a best-selling
wonderful.
book. Now, if
Okay.
you look at me today, taking away the screen sharing and back to everyday life, you'll notice that I'm looking a little worse for wear. I took on a German Shepherd who was a homeless dog, lovely dog. His name's Denver. I've got bruises on my hands as well. For the last 2 years, he has been without a home, and he's a really lovely guy. I really like him, good friend. But in the process, I will admit that he has been, sort of without the guidance and support that he needed. And he leaves marks on us all the time. Is still very new in this venture. So I work at a warming center called the Brothel Warming Center. Right now, it's the Brothel All Season Center because we don't want to call it warming during the midst of heat waves here in Brockville. But long story short, I deal with, last night, I believe we had 20 drop-ins, 10 overnight and 4 at the door. So it could be anywhere between 7 a night to 40 a night. It all really depends on the circumstances. And some of them have homes. Some of them come here for socialization. Some of them come for communication and interest in learning about things. Some of us come to us sometimes because they need wraparound supports and they think that we could be a great referral tool. Some come for a free meal and they venture back out into society at large, hoping that they have been able to manage their circumstances as best they can. Some of them have some chronic issues, which are debilitating, exhausting, and challenging. And others, on the other hand, are just one paycheck away from you and I. And I think that's something that I definitely want to mention here in this presentation. So you'll have to forgive me for not
That's
looking
all
my
right.
Playboy best today. But Denver's a good guy, and he's 2 years old, and he's a handsome fellow, and he's adjusting well to our circumstances. And it's just going to take some time, and all good things do. I often
Wonderful.
reference what I do as hard. I love people who are hard to love for a living. That includes animals who are generally pretty easy to love, in spite of their obstacles. So I'm really grateful to those of you who participated today. Just thank you so much for having me. You've been wonderful
Thank
for this
you.
process.
Well, we're
As
excited
some,
to learn about tiny
yeah,
homes.
you bet. So
So would
the
you like me
reason
to
why
share the screen?
yes, please. I
Okay.
give all of this preamble, but this preamble is directly involved with what I do. So she's been kind enough to show this here. This right here is our website. You notice that beautiful little handsome logo that says Tiny Home Alliance Canada. Now we're going to go to About. If we can go to About, that would be
Okay.
great.
Yeah.
You're my go-to girl today. You've been top drawer,
No
just outstanding
problem.
for this process. Tiny Home Alliance is a Canadian not-for-profit organization founded in 2014 and was the first online resource for accessing tiny home information. Purpose is to provide an online and personal resource for Canadians who are curious about alternative housing, such as tiny homes, microhomes, earthships, yurts, and more. Now, why I think this is interesting is because the fact is that dealing with Western Retail Lumber Association, one of the innovations that's come through tiny homes in the last, I don't know, I'm going to say 18 months. I could be wrong because I'm sure it was happening in other places before it was happening here, was 3D print tiny homes, which in essence is not necessarily trumpeting the positives of the lumber industry. But if I was to herald back to wartime housing, which we see in most communities, and definitely a lot in Southeastern Ontario where I'm from, if I go to Kingston, I could find wartime housing everywhere I go. They were homes that were a minimum square footage, which is significantly less than the square footage that we're used to at this time. And I think it's pretty important to think about as someone from the East Coast of Canada. I just went through Newfoundland by vehicle in a recent trip, with some family issues we had to deal with. And honestly, some of these homes by today's standards would never in a million years pass our current municipal ordinances across this country. Interestingly enough, they're stunning. And they're such a huge, rich part of the tapestry of what we do as Canadians, what we are as a civilization. And very much as Newfoundlanders, with Jelly Bean Row and all of the beautiful, colorful, unique housing types that we're known for, are such an indelible part of our economy. I think today you notice that the topic is talking about, a very small solution to a big problem. And I think that that's something that I'm going to try to focus on. I'm not going to bombard you with stats that I don't have because the issue is continuously evolving. I'm not going to tell you why you should look at this as any more than a niche issue, although I would argue that if you do, you're doing so at your own chagrin as developers and as retailers and providers. I'm going to do so from a number of different hats. One, as an activist. I have spent my life, as I said just a moment ago, loving people who are hard to love for a living. And I don't think that's a fair, accurate representation of some of the people I serve who are incredibly easy to love. And I by no means want to speak on behalf of a warming center, which I don't have the ability to do, or the other organizations I've been involved with. But sitting on the lived experience committee for the uh, rural and remote, association for homelessness across Canada. So dealing with organizations that I think, Canadian Alliance to Homelessness, and some of these incredible organizations that I've delegated to, like mayors caucuses on affordable housing, and all of these different issues that all basically come back to one piece, which is that at this moment we are facing a housing crunch in this economy. There are people who are not able to access an affordable home. I live in a beautiful 3.5 bedroom apartment that I have been in for the better part of 15 years. My mother and I were homeless at one point as well. I'll get to that throughout the story. But I can say that if we were to relocate tomorrow, which could happen through a renoviction, it could happen based on the fact that the homeowner, the landlord, who is just the best, and I'll happily shout out to a national audience here at Home to Brockville, Dave Wood has been the best landlord I could ask for. But long story short, if for some reason he decided that his daughter or his cousin or something needed this unit for whatever reason to go back to school, because there's a community college here, St. Lawrence College does great things and they're expanding their programming on a regular basis. So all of a sudden he needs this unit, whether I believe him or not, whether it's genuine or not. And in his case, it's never been anything but genuine. But for the sake of this example, as an anecdote, we could find ourselves having to go and trying to find a comparable place in this neighborhood that could never compare to the cost. And the reason why is because we've been grandfathered into a process, and that process has not allowed us to create any personal equity. It may allow us to create a great personal reference, but the truth is we've been paying someone else's mortgage for 15 years. And now he keeps us around because the truth is we're good tenants. We love our community. We love this neighborhood, and we're grateful to be in this position. And we've been able to manage through that process and have a great relationship with the other tenants in the building. Doesn't change the fact that for some people who are just starting out, they don't have that lineage, they don't have that support, they don't have that resource, and they're depending on their reference. Meanwhile, they leave in debt. We currently, statistically, if I'm going to use a statistic, here's a great one. Here in Canada, we are leading North America and leading the Western world in household debt. So what's interesting about tiny homes and why I've always trumpeted them is that most people don't realize that this is still a property that conceivably you could mortgage. So if I'm a real estate developer and I am a real estate agent, I am actually someone who's involved in mortgages and acquisitions, all these pieces that are attached to my local bank, et cetera. There's really no reason not to be on the tiny home bandwagon, because even if it's not the same dollar figure that you're used to, it's also an easier sell. So put in perspective, if I'm selling a $500,000 property, maybe I'm pouring resources into that open house. I am doing all I can to make sure that it's a professional video. I am rattling the cages and shaking the trees, hoping something falls out that's tangible. And I am doing my best, and that could be on the market for X number of months or years or who knows. Whereas with a tiny house, it's a very quick turnaround. Some people are simply not in a position to go out and purchase the modern house for the modern nuclear family. And a lot of the reason why is because the modern nuclear family doesn't exist. So
Yes.
the reason why I think this is important is that I want to talk about this agency and this organization because you could join too. Let's take a look at the membership page.
Okay. We did have a question quickly, Lee, if we could.
Sure.
Would you like to take questions while we go along?
Sure. I can't
Okay.
promise I have answers. I apologize.
Okay,
ahead
well,
of time,
no,
but I
that's
will
fine.
try my
This may be
darndest.
good. So do you have any indications of what normally the average cost to build a tiny house is roughly?
I've heard everywhere between 12 and 70,000. Now,
So
quite
depending on
frankly,
what you
yeah,
lay
it
out
really
and stuff
does.
like that. Okay.
Because if you were to look at homelessness prevention, which is a huge piece of the discussion that you're seeing throughout COVID-19, you're seeing some pretty substandard tiny homes. Now, granted, any growth of that movement is something I want to trumpet. Some of these unique social enterprise movements, positive charitable projects have been great. And I am by no means trying to overgeneralize or tear down, but you've also seen tiny homes that have shared restroom accommodations. They're not quite the Shangri-La that you see for the cabins in the woods, which could cost up to 120 or 200,000. That said, those are very uncommon as well. Somewhere in the middle, you have a property that you're able to mitigate for a much less level of cost and a much less level of resource. Now, what I think is interesting about our association and why I bring up the memberships is I want to get this out of the way ahead of time so that I'm not inundating you guys with some sale pitch that isn't appropriate for today. But I'm doing my part as the executive director of a fledgling organization that, as you saw, 2014, we're 7, 8 years old. We're not a big organization. We are mostly volunteer run, passionate advocates about issues that are very important to us. Now, I do not live in a tiny home. I work at a warming center. I can take a membership as a general member for $25 a year. Recently, I've been upgrading some of my education and conceivably get a membership for $20 a year.
Mhm.
If I'm a business, it's a whopping $100 a year. Now, here's what's most important about that is that it does not entitle you to advertising on our page, so that through our social media pages and through our website, we are out there saying that this is the greatest tiny home that was ever made of all time. Oh my God. What it instead does is say, hey, by the way, you could help support this movement moving forward. You can be a part of the solution as opposed to the problem. You can say that you want to support a professional organization of activists, advocates, and home dwellers all at the same time. In the past calendar year, we have had a great organization called 3D Printed Tiny Homes, who are currently finalists, top 10 finalists in a design challenge nationally, take an active role. Our current interim president at this moment before AGM is someone who lives in a tiny home.
Okay.
Before that, we had award-winning designers of tiny homes at all levels of cost and entry into the housing market. And then you have myself, who is, an active member of the board as an executive director, who's never lived in a tiny home, but sees the benefits. And I'll tell you what, I'm sitting here today with my beautiful mother, who I love very much and who I support, and she supports me. We live together in this circumstance. We are not in a position where someone who's getting married September 3rd, where I can just go out and buy a home in an inflated housing market. What I can say is, while I might want to be able to have that personal autonomy so that my partner and I can have a positive private life and, grow together as people, I don't necessarily want my mother to be cast out into the world in a time when we know through COVID-19 that homelessness was apparent in ways that had never been before, where long-term care presented challenges it never did before, including national reports about some of the challenges people are facing. I lost a grandmother in October who was living in long-term care, who I hardly got to see or touch throughout that whole process. We know aging in place is more important now to Canadians than it's ever been before, on top of housing affordability. So putting all of these pieces together, we've got a conundrum of issues. One being that most people cannot just simply move out in today's economy and manage a rent or manage some type of agreement at an affordable cost on a fixed income. Most housing, we saw statistically throughout North America that even if you were making the minimum wage, you cannot live in any type of reasonable, affordable accommodation of any kind in most of North America on a full-time minimum wage. On top of all of these variables, you also have people who are dealing with health challenges, some of which are terminal, some of which will continue to present themselves because we are learning every day how to be better citizens. We know that dementia rates have risen in this country, and we know that household debt has as well. You put all of this smorgasbord together under one umbrella, and what do you see? You see a need for more deeply, and I say deeply, in asterisks, affordable housing. But that doesn't mean it has to be government subsidized. What it could mean is let's give that couple, like my partner and I at 34, an opportunity to go and build equity by owning a home that maybe isn't our final destination, but could be that incredible starting point. Or maybe it's our retirement destination and we want to get out of the urban sprawl of the glebe in Ottawa, an hour away from me, where people are living in high-rise apartments and condominiums for significant dollar figures. And they're still working from home. They're not enjoying the waterfront. They're not in a safe place where they feel that they are not exposed to contaminants. They're tired of waiting in traffic. I remember Justin Trudeau a number of years ago at I think it was a Liberal federal convention. As media, I covered it. I'm by no means out here and singing the praises or endorsements during an election year of any particular candidate. But he talked about his friend, and it was some made up name, but sitting in traffic in Montreal. That's the standard bearer for the Canadian economy. Right now, if I move to Newfoundland, I can live in Petty Harbor, just outside of the metropolis. And I can get back and forth to my place of work in 10 minutes flat, 20 in bad weather. And it's the most stunning, beautiful piece of paradise that exists. But for a lot of us who live in a lot of the mainland of our Western economy, Sitting in traffic for an hour or an hour and a half a day each way is not even considered abnormal. It's considered par for the course for what we make. And then we get home to a place that many times isn't ours. We're paying someone else's mortgage. We're trying to organize a meeting to go visit a family who are in long-term care, who are aging, who are not able to age in place because we don't have those variables in place. We're arguing with our municipalities about a minimum square footage, minimum setbacks, who controls the water and sewer, how do we have joint and severed liability in these processes, who is responsible ultimately, what is the property value, and does my neighbor hate the fact that my home is not the same size? And we've convinced people that bigger is better. So I don't come at it from the place of the home dweller. I don't come at it from the place of the builder. I come at it from the place of the fact that I have a client at my warming center at 59 years old who's had no justice involvement for most of his life, who is on a disability support payment. And on his disability support payment, he has a better chance of paying a mortgage than he does of renting a unit in my community. And even that is at best. So it becomes
do you believe that the tiny, sorry, Lee, I just wanted to interrupt you there for a second. Do you believe that the tiny home movement is sort of helping to reduce the barriers to home ownership? And, or do you think, what do you think the biggest barriers to the tiny home movement are at this time?
Sounds good. So I'm going to say that ideally, yes. As a concept, tiny homes absolutely reduce the barriers because you're able to pull personal equity from the space. You are able to live in somewhere that is not second rate or substandard. You might see those unique examples and anecdotes. Like I could pull from any condominium tower, any major home, any regular, duplex, any regular townhouse that would say that this isn't exactly what you want. Or you might be able to be in a scenario where you look at some of these and go, my gosh, they wouldn't be making TLC programs about homes that were undesirable. So yes, number one is you may be able to pull equity for a young couple. You may be able to age in place. You may be able to take care of the social ills and challenges that are faced. On top of that, you might be able to just create something that says that bigger isn't better anymore. We have a government that is investing significant dollars in the Green Municipal Fund. And if you were to look at the Green Municipal Fund, some of the applicants have been tiny home developers.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yes, big time. And the reason why is because not only do we have a national housing strategy, which allows dollars of investment at this time, more time than ever before, $40 billion plus is being invested in home development because we recognize nationally we have a housing crunch. Some of that may go to refurbishing parking lots. Some of that may go to supporting developers who want to build condominium towers who at an affordable rate using some type of accessory loan. Point is, nonetheless, is there's also significant dollars being poured into innovative housing solution, into learning labs, into green municipal funds, things that I come across my desk every day in a different realm and different world that I live in, where we're looking for net energy zero. We're looking for opportunities where this could be sustainable. And if anything, could possibly be a retrofit, could be a brand new reimagination of that parking lot in your community that exists now, of that backyard or laneway that's underused. The challenge is, and I think one of the questions you asked, if I may,
yes, the barriers, the biggest barriers to the movement.
The barrier is people like me. So I'm a municipal politician. Now, take me away from the natural example, because obviously, if I was the barrier, I wouldn't be giving this presentation personally. But as a whole, we have convinced our society that we need to get away from wartime housing. We've convinced our society that we need minimum square footages, and that the idea of living in somewhere that is for some reason more cabin-esque or not exactly the size that we thought it would need to be means that it's substandard. And well, I don't want that in my backyard. NIMBYism is the biggest issue I face in homelessness prevention. It's the biggest issue I face in tiny homes as well. The fact is that people have this assumption that a tiny home in their community is going to drop the property value. The property value is completely based on speculation. So in essence, just having that opinion probably dropped the property value, but there's really no mathematics to support it. So let's go through this website a little more if we can, and continue with this process.
Oh, sure. Sorry. Do you need me to go to another page?
You're doing great. Let's go to resources for just a second.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go to resources.
So I mentioned earlier, if you take out a membership in our association, it does not necessarily mean that you get to advertise through our page, although we will congratulate brand new members. We will send you a shout out, a link right to your page. And more importantly, one thing we do, whether you're a member or not, but say you're involved in tiny home building and you've won an award, or your community is going through a conversation about whether or not to allow tiny homes, or whether there's some amazing project coming forward that's for the betterment of the community at large, send it my way, because I will post it. Because we're always looking for opportunities to normalize tiny homes. We're always looking for ways to say, hey, by the way, this builder did something really spectacular and innovative, and we want to share that with the world. Hey, by the way,
Okay,
this
great.
community is considering it. They don't have to be members for me to say that this is
Okay,
a good news
great.
story.
Oh, that's
Okay?
good for our retailer members and our other members to know that too. Thank you.
Exactly. And but that said, if you did want to support the cause as a tax write-off, a whole whopping $100 membership can help move this forward. And you have the opportunity to donate too. But furthermore, if you go to news, you're frozen here. Hello, there you are. All right, if you go to news for me for just a
Oh,
second. All right, so we're on news. You're staggering, so I apologize if I'm coming across discombobulated too. I hope you can hear me properly.
no, we can hear you perfectly.
Perfect. Okay. I can't hear you quite as well, but I will take your word for it. You'll notice that we have regular updates, obviously a little less during summer months, but regular updates about what we're up to. The second one is a special podcast link for Tiny House Listings Canada. That's a brand new organization that we're working with, where we talk about some of the issues that are going on. You'll notice Janet Thome is pushing towards a global standard for tiny homes. And of course, we're always making notice of the fact that our next annual general meeting is announced for October 4th. So I'll take this opportunity to note that we have openings on our board of directors. And again, they don't have to be tied to people living in tiny homes or building tiny homes. Maybe you want to push your organization forward and you want to talk about this issue because you're passionate about it. Maybe something unique is going on in your community that's talking about a variance. Maybe you are an advocate or someone who has had first-hand experience. I had an experience very briefly and terminally in my life. I don't want to overstate it, but at one point, my mother and I faced homelessness. That's something that I think makes this conversation relevant, because where were we staying? Well, we were staying at a campground. Now, for us, it was a tent, but for others, it was a cabin. What's the difference really between a cabin with shared amenities and some of the tiny home communities you're seeing pop up around the international? Well, the difference is we were paying someone else to exist as opposed to building equity for ourselves. We weren't safe in our environment. We weren't safe in our accommodation, other than that we had some lovely people who were actively looking for our success and wanted to be a part of it. The truth is that tiny homes would have been an incredible opportunity for us to have been able to build a mortgage, build a credit, to rebuild credit, to create an opportunity, and it would have been nickels on the dollars for what the average rental accommodation looks like in our community.
Right.
So
and is that traditionally what you're seeing in terms of the initial movement? Is it more about building communities and that step up, or are you reference the Netflix or TLC shows that are the other popular thing too? So is it kind of to each half and half?
It's a mix of both. One is most of the articles you're going to research for North America, most of the things you're going to see popping up are COVID municipal responses to COVID-19 and how to help those who are told to shelter in place when there's nowhere for them to shelter. And honestly, some people look at that and go, okay, so this has become a niche issue, it's charitable, and they disregard it. The fact is that some of those communities are stunning, they're a miracle, and they're incredible. I look at a place just a little bit west of me in Kingston. We had a tent camp that had 45 people in it. What we learned through the CDC during COVID-19 is that it was better to keep those people in that space to receive services than it would have been to have broken it up and have them on a street corner somewhere else. Because one thing that's great about the tiny home communities that you're seeing, especially if they come from low income or challenges or circumstances, there's no perfect system. You go to a nonprofit housing community, you go to a low income community, you've heard the terms ghettos. I can imagine if you go to a tent camp or you go to a tiny home place for people who've been through level of addiction, for instance, that you're going to hear similar challenges and obstacles, because it's a great breeding ground. I always go back to, Jesse Pinkman in Breaking Bad going to a Narcotics Anonymous meeting to push his product. The fact is, you're always going to have people who have bad intentions who know that there's a built-in audience in certain places they go. I see that in the homelessness sector regularly.
Yes.
But what is missing from that discussion is that you have people who are needing that personal dignity and that autonomy. They need a place where they can call their own. And now they're also able to rely on in-person supports that you can triangulate to this space very quickly. because as opposed to having outreach workers from your local health authorities and local social service agencies trying to find people in all the corners of the universe, you could send them to this space where there may be 10, 12, 15, 25, 40, etc., all in one congregated space. But on top of that, you also have other people to rely on. Not everyone who ends up in a housing precarious scenario is necessarily dealing with some type of chronic behavioral or justice issue. Some of them are just struggling based on the fact that they're financially not able to go other places. And then you have people who are able to touch each other and to check on each other and go, I haven't seen Frank in a few days. Maybe I should go check on him. Those things are amazing. And that part's huge. But the other piece, the other most predominant piece we're seeing in this sector is the luxury tiny home. And the luxury tiny home deserves some conversation here. It might not be why I got involved. Yeah. But the fact is if there are Airbnbs being rented that have this piece of this discussion, I think it's worth warranting that that's normalizing tiny homes. It might be the most expensive version of it. It might not be exactly why an advocate like me who wants to put up his fist and go is why. But at the same time, why is it a great news story? Because obviously it dispels the myth that this is substandard housing that nobody finds attractive. People are willing to pay great dollars to stay in these places.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that was actually a question that did come up with regards to myths around tiny homes. Is there any, like, there is a myth or are they more vulnerable to natural disasters? Or is that just a myth that's been put out there that, you know, your tiny home is more vulnerable to tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, those kind of things, any more or less than, say, a normal sized house?
I think that there's some truth to some of this, which is that, let's be real, you know, you've got, if someone's home is on wheels, then technically it's susceptible to being stolen. It doesn't mean it's a simple process. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen overnight. But of course, insurance premiums will be higher. Is a secondary suite susceptible to a tornado? I guess, obviously, it would be, I suppose. Is this common? No.
Are all tiny homes, like, and I guess I should have mentioned earlier, is a tiny home common layout? Is it always mobile, or there are permanent tiny home structures within communities that you've mentioned?
There are absolutely not only hybrid foundations for those that are mobile, but on top of that, there are also many that are stand ground housing. Let me give you an example. Has anyone ever heard of a cottage cluster? Has anyone heard of a summer house? Has anyone ever heard of the what's the term? Grandma suite? All of these are technically tiny homes. Laneway housing is exactly that. And we're seeing some of these properties being sold for $1 million in Toronto, which is staggering. You know, and you're looking at organizations trying to come up with what is the international variance at this time for tiny homes on wheels. Nomadland won Oscar awards for people living in their vehicles. You know, these are real conversations. It's not mythos at this time. It's reality. And I think that it's interesting because while that might show the good and the bad of it, the fact is it also shows that these communities exist. And some of these people are coming to it for very different reasons. Some people are downsizing. Some people are naturally just attracted to that lifestyle. And it's amazing that opportunities can support it. But in terms of myths, the mythos is that a tiny home in your community lowers your property value. There's no math to indicate that. Another myth would be that every time social service involvement comes, that it's really just charity, when in fact, it still changes what your community looks like. And it's a wonderful thing and can be incredibly vibrant and beautiful. And maybe someone drives by that encampment of houses and goes, my goodness, I could live in one of those. So the truth is it's moving up in the world. There's no way sense of to call it a niche market. I think is poor form today because we have tiny homes that are being rented on Airbnbs for exorbitant dollars on a regular basis with wait lists. We have people who are seeking the cabin experience, and we have people who want their loved ones to live at home, and people working at home want their office at home, and that could be a tiny home as well. And we saw that referenced in the Globe and Mail. So at this moment, you've got everything from your more exotic organizations who are looking to create some level of recreation, some level of tourism, microtourism as it may be. You have people who are looking to house loved ones, and people who are working from home or tired of commuting to the large urban center, who are all looking at tiny homes in a different way than they would have if we just simply disregarded it as a way to solve homelessness. All of the above are a part of the discussion. It doesn't change the fact that there's no one fit for me, like I said, getting married next month, if my partner and I could have a tiny home that could help us build equity, that would be amazing. If my mother could live adjacent to us so that we had our private space, but I could always possibly check on her and make sure
Right.
that she was safe, that would be wonderful. And neither of us are looking for a charitable handout in the process.
Right. And is there a standard that is considered a tiny house? Is this a standard square footage or a common layout that tiny homes must fall under in order to fall into the category?
No. So at the moment, IRC, international building codes have talked about this piece. I know here in Ontario, for instance, we've talked about secondary suites and tiny home development, but it's actually pretty frigid and pretty straightforward about what is allowed and what's not, versus BC, where you have a little more flexibility, in Alberta, where you have more flexibility. And if you were to look just on the page that you're sharing, it says Janet Thome pushing towards the global standard for tiny homes.
That down there.
That's because at this moment, in spite of all of these international guidelines and all these variances, you have people who will order a home that's been inspected as a prefab through Kijiji, and then it has been almost torn apart and considered uninhabitable because the local inspector didn't get to go through it before it was ordered. This is the biggest barrier that this particular issue is facing, and it's bureaucratic. Plain and simple. No ways, ands, or buts about it.
Right. So each municipality or it's impacted by the local building codes. So when you mention that, it's interesting because that was my next question was I saw at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this huge article on Amazon's top selling tiny house for $20,000 and they had sold out. And I was interested to know your opinion on things like that. But as you've mentioned, people can buy these things if they're not cleared through the municipality, you're ending up just starting from scratch, correct?
Oh, for sure. And I think about places like here in northern Ontario, where you have flooding every year, and you have Indigenous communities that largely were untouched by COVID-19. How amazing some of those prefab housing could have been because they were on wheels and could have easily been moved away from flood zones and kept everyone isolating safely. But there's just no bylaw or in place to support that at this moment. And we have clustered this process. And I think that if I'm a Western Retail Lumber Association, or I am a tiny home association, or I'm a builder or an advocate, the biggest thing that I could say to my local municipality and the biggest thing I could say to my local decision makers is we need an international standard, and we need to get on page with it as quickly as possible, because this movement is passing us by. It's happening all over the world. And it's attractive. And there are legitimate reasons now more than ever to participate in this process, and a housing crunch and housing affordability being number one. Keeping all that in mind, the fact is it seems like community to community, town to town, district to district, region to region, there's another reason why this continues to be a niche issue, and it doesn't need to be. We all need a home. Housing is the home of all issues. The only reason this is complicated is because government decided to complicate it, not because there's not opportunities for economic development, stimulate growth, population growth, and for just generally for people to go out and, as opposed to just taking on debt after debt to pay someone else's mortgage, actually be homeowners of their own in some of the excess lands that we have.
Right. All right. That's wonderful. Thank you. Again, I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions, to use the Q&A or the chat function. I'm just answering them as they come up, but let me know. Lee, do you need me to go to another page?
No, honestly, I didn't want to oversell it. What I want to say is
thank you. That's great. Well, we're really interested. Yes.
Yeah, we've got resources. I've given you the about. I would love for you to take out a membership just to support our organization.
I encourage everybody to check out it's tinyhomealliance.ca, and I suggest everyone check that out, because that's how we found you searching, and we were really curious. One question that did come up here, sorry. Is there any sort of common tiny home layout that you're aware of? Is it their standards, or is it all just, I guess the ... is it make it up as you go, or is there standard layouts?
We've seen 7 to 1,200 to 1,700 square feet. Most times it's under 2,000. Obviously, to keep it tiny. But there's not been any one particular. I know that some builders only deal in specific specs, but other builders don't. And it all depends on where they are geographically across the country.
Now, in terms of the items that are in the house, some of the hard goods, like things like smaller sinks, smaller toilets, that kind of stuff, are those kind of things that you are now seeing more in the market, in the building and hardware market, or is that something that you still think there's a gap for more of these sort of smaller compressed items that can fit into places like these versus large scale hard goods?
Again, I think it depends on the builder, because the truth
Okay.
is I know people who would pay extra for something that feels ultra modern, but also
Mhm.
feels contemporary.
Okay.
Generally speaking, I know the Enviro toilets are great. There's a lot of different pieces that I'm seeing in terms of how people are piping these places, how people are putting their foundations in place.
Mhm.
But yes, as a rule, these are smaller accommodation pieces, and if you are wise to start supporting this movement
Mhm.
and this sector, it's to keep in mind that micro and accessible is better.
Right. And I really appreciate you also bringing up how some of these communities can really help address the issue of homelessness. I know here in Winnipeg, they've been looking at some spaces for that. And I think, to have a negative association with a tiny home it's really about differentiating that this can have bad things can happen in any community. And, this is about keeping people, again, together in a community that provides supports for them.
Mhm. I don't have a lot more to share other than that
Oh,
I
that's
think this is
wonderful. I really
you know,
appreciate your time,
yeah,
Lee.
you bet.
I don't think I have any more questions coming up. I just want to thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your time so much. I know you are extraordinarily busy, so I appreciate you being able to find some time to talk with us about the Tiny Home Alliance. I encourage everybody to check out their website, to take out a membership. And if you want to reach out to Lee, you can reach out to Lee and ask more questions or ask their alliance more questions. And I also just want to take a moment again to thank our sponsor, Axio, for sponsoring this conversation around the tiny home movement. Lee, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time. I'm going to stop sharing that screen so you don't have to look at it, so we can just see each other now. And really, again, if anybody has any questions, we are going to have this recorded, and I will provide the recording to everybody after this. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it, and I look forward to people supporting this movement as much as possible. Let's normalize
Oh,
time.
wonderful.